Well, we are. I have good news. As far as I know, we have 5 uninterrupted Sundays, starting with today till early June. So we're going to be moving along, and my plan, if all goes well, is to get right to the very front edge of the Protestant Reformation by the time we are at the end of this 5-week piece. So we're right in the middle, as you know now, of the period that is dominated by the Crusades and other not very pretty aspects of late medieval Christian history. The Crusade period really leads us into the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is the link then really up to the Reformation. So I want to save that for next year. We'll slow down the pace a little bit next year as I'm envisioning it, and spend some time looking at the major personalities and events connected to the Reformation, and really tracing from that point on the history of the church, especially looking at the Presbyterian Church. We are, after all, Presbyterians, and so we'll take a closer look at our own beginnings and something of hopefully even American Presbyterianism and even this church. That's my plan before we're done. So we have lots on the agenda yet, but right now we're still back around the year 1100. We're looking this morning at the 12th century, and this is right in the middle of the Crusades. We were noticing last time we were together some of the causes of the Crusades. And this morning I want to, just to kind of finish the picture, talk about the rest of the Crusades very briefly. I know this is probably not the most burning issue in your mind, is the history of the Crusades, but it does help to have something of its history in mind, and more importantly, really the effects. How did Europe change as a result? Because that does in many ways condition the rest of the story that we want to tell. So if you'll kind of slog through with me, we'll take a little bit of a look at that. The other thing I'd like to focus on this morning, however, is probably what I would call the earliest of what are sometimes called the pre-Reformation reformers. The Reformation didn't just get going, out of the blue. There were those who were coming along prior to Martin Luther who were saying much the same thing as he was. Their voices tended to be silenced. So Martin Luther wasn't the first guy in town to figure out that there was too much emphasis on a kind of superstitious level of Christian practice and too little on the heart of faith. And of course, Luther wanted to put a much more heavy emphasis on faith, indeed faith alone, as the means of justification. But others had said that before him. Usually the person who is identified as this first so-called pre-Reformation reformer, in fact sometimes called I've heard this term, the morning star of the Reformation. Anybody know whose nickname is that? Anybody have an idea? I'll leave Herm out of this. He'll know the answer to that, I suppose. But anybody know? John Wycliffe. And you know that name, John Wycliffe. He's famous for having translated the Bible into English. And of course, the Wycliffe Bible translators take their name from him and their inspiration from his career. So you have Wycliffe. He's 1300s. A guy that was a follower of Wycliffe, who was really the next link, you might say, was John Huss. We'll look at his life sometime a little later. He followed Wycliffe. He was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 415. Luther, early in his career, was called a Hussite, you see, associated with Huss, who was associated with Wycliffe. So usually they're mentioned. Another guy that's sometimes put on the short list of pre-Reformation reformers is named William Savonarola. Who's heard of William Savonarola? He was famous in connection with the Renaissance, really at the height of Florentine Renaissance era period. He was really the great moral voice there in Florence. He was not so much a Protestant in his thought. He considered himself a true son of the Catholic Church, but he was very critical of the moral corruption that was characterizing the church. So all of these guys are showing up as a sort of interesting constellation of reformers before the Reformation. But the guy that I'd like to focus on this morning actually predates all of them, and he's the one I would call the morning star of the Reformation. 12th century character, started a movement which persisted for some 300 or 400 years, was heavily persecuted by Catholic authorities throughout those hundreds of years. He was originally from France, born in Lyon, and I would call him the morning star of the Reformation, and his name is, who knows? Herm, you know who I'm thinking of? You ever heard of, many people haven't heard of this guy, Peter Waldo. Any takers on that one? Peter Waldo, and the Waldensians is the group that's associated with him. Well, you see, this is good. You're very represented. Many people have never heard of him, but in many ways, this is where the tide begins to change. And you might say the very earliest inkling of what would eventually become the great reform of the Christian movement begins, I think, with this guy. So anyway, we're going to take a little time to look at him. As I think about Waldo's career, reflecting this past week especially on what text of Scripture might be appropriate, my mind went to the book of Revelation, not Revelations. Revelation, and one of the letters to one of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation is addressed to the church at Smyrna. You're familiar with those 2 chapters, chapters 2 and 3, which include 7 letters, and each church does represent in some sense a distinct condition that the church may be in. One of the churches, for example, gets all criticism, no praise. Everything that is addressed to that church is negative, virtually everything. That's the church at Sardis. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. Wake up. That's the message to them. There's also a church that receives only praise, only commendation, no criticism. That church is Smyrna. It's the city today in Turkey called Izmir. It's the birthplace of Homer, by the way, just a little trivia there. But Smyrna at the time was a church that was beleaguered, didn't feel like it had much political clout in the community for sure, felt like it was on the run, on the ropes. And especially the group that seemed to be responsible primarily for mobilizing the avalanche of attack against this small church in Smyrna was the Jewish community. You know that through the years, especially in the early years of the church's history, it was the Jewish population that often were at the forefront of persecuting efforts against the church. We see that in the life of the Apostle Paul. It seems to have been the case in the city of Smyrna. And so there's a rather strong statement that's made in this letter, and it reads this way. It says, "I know the slander on the part of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." That's pretty strong language. These people say they are Jews. They meet in what they call a synagogue, devoted to the worship of God. But the perspective of Revelation, and really in many ways the perspective of the New Testament, is they are not true Jews. Paul says in Romans, he is not a Jew who is simply one outwardly. Circumcision is not outward in the flesh, ultimately, you see. And so this is really capturing something of that strong perspective in the New Testament and putting it probably as bold a statement on it as you can imagine. Well, I'm thinking of Peter Waldo. His conflict was not so much with a Jewish population, but with the official Christian church. And I can imagine, in fact, I think you'll probably agree with me by the time we're done, that if he had thought about it in this way, he would have read this verse like this, applying it to himself. "I know the slander of those who say they are Christians, but are not, are rather a church of Satan." Waldo used very strong language in his criticism of the authorities of the official church of his day, and he in fact virtually said as much. So at the risk of seeming a little bit controversial here, I'm going to suggest we hear this letter with that in mind, and then when we look at his life, hopefully that'll make sense. So let's read it. I'll read it as written here, but think about it in terms of Waldo's experience. This is verse 8, Revelation chapter 2, the Word of God. "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Look out. The devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful even until death, and I will give you a crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. So that text, and we'll come back with a comment on that a little later, but let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we're grateful for your mercies to us. We thank you for the beauty of this day, this Lord's Day that you have created for our benefit and packed it full of blessings, many of which we see, most of which we don't see, don't even think of. And yet you're constantly hovering over us and watching over and protecting and impressing into our lives your grace. We give you thanks that you have been doing this all through history and that you have, on special occasions, taken individual people and made significant use of them to alter the very course of history. We pray that our reflection on just such a character this morning would be illumined by your Spirit. All of this we ask in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, before Peter Waldo, the fun part, a little bit of schoolwork. Oh, this is the Crusades. 12th century, we're looking now, keeping our pace, 1100 to 1200. We started talking about the Crusades last time, 3 weeks ago, but you all remember it because you've all been reviewing it, haven't you? All this time it's been in your mind, so I don't need to go back through that, but I will just briefly. The First Crusade, remember, probably the most legitimate in its motives, because this was when the Seljuk Turks, or call it, swept across the regions controlled by Islam, but viewed these more moderate Islamic types as having departed from the true faith, drove them out. These were classic militant Islamic warriors who really got their inspiration from Muhammad himself, who was a warrior. They believed they were reinstating a true Islamic faith, and they came right to the outskirts of Constantinople, you recall. So the leadership there panics and calls for the Pope, hoping the Pope will muster an army to come and rescue them. This is one of several steps along the way in which I think the Pope, the papacy, is kind of moving away from its moral center to an increasingly political center as a view of its own authority. In my opinion, and this is controversial, I'm just telling you this is kind of my view of it, I think it all started back when the Pope became a king. He became a Pope/king, and that happened back in the 800s with the creation of the Papal States, which was a pretty good sized piece of real estate, and over that region the Pope was the king and began to view himself not simply as a religious leader, but truly as a king, as a political leader, and that put him into the fray of competition with other kings. Except that the Pope always had this little additional trump card he could play, that he was also the head of the church. You know, it kind of gave him this improved position over the rest of the rulers. And it seems to have begun there. It doesn't seem to have been too much abused at the beginning, but increasingly you see the Pope in a contest with other political rulers. And this is becoming more and more evident, so that by the time we get to the beginning of the Crusades in the late 11th century, about the year 1099, we see that the Pope actually takes himself as one with the authority to call forth military actions, to muster armies, to invoke, you see, in the political powers of Europe, the responses that are required. And you have this, and then the Pope can add to it these rather extravagant promises. For example, Urban II promised that anybody who went on that first crusade to rescue Constantinople would have complete plenary forgiveness of sins. Cool. I thought there was something about repentance there. I thought there was something about faith in Christ. No, just go on the crusade. Well, this is a little over the top. I mean, even Roman Catholic historians will grant this. I'm not at this point being overly hostile. Catholic historians who I've read on this will agree this was not a great moment, you know, for kind of papal integrity. So anyway, this is what's happening. It's a mix of what may have been, by some measures, a just war, but at the same time mixed into it was some rather misguided ideas that are theological and political, and they all have their convergence there in the Pope. So anyway, the First Crusade militarily was a success. Jerusalem was taken in 1099. Pilgrimages were once again possible. Everything seemed to be okay until the Second Crusade, 1145, when some of the real estate taken by the First Crusaders was taken back. And so the Pope at that time authorized a Second Crusade, which was largely, as you recall, organized by Bernard of Clairvaux. This was probably the least wonderful aspect of his career, which I think he eventually realized himself. But he went on that crusade. The crusade itself was quite a failure. Personally, he was very deeply moved by visiting Jerusalem, revisiting those places that are part of the Via Dolorosa, the Stations of the Cross. And he really gives us a very new and much more healthy emphasis on the humanity of Christ, the passion of Christ, and so on. So even though the crusade itself was not necessarily a great success, we would say that at least in Bernard's case and the effects of his career, it was helpful to the Christian church. But this one didn't amount to much. And that brings us to the third one. We didn't talk about this one yet. Probably the most famous. This is the Third Crusade, and this is dated to 1189. What happened here was that a genius Islamic general named Saladin retakes Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been under European control, Christian control, since 1099. So for the better part of 100 years, Jerusalem had been viewed as a possession of the Christian church and the West. But now Saladin, in a rather brilliant and rapid stroke, is able to take it back. And that, of course, jolts Christian Europe. And so the Pope at the time, once again, summons the European military powers to respond to that. The guy who was appointed to lead this Third Crusade was named Frederick of Barbarossa. Barbarossa is a region in the north of Italy, and Frederick himself was at the time the Holy Roman Emperor. And he had had a rather tense relationship with the Pope, as had most of these Holy Roman Emperors. We've talked about that before. Frederick was no exception. It was a power struggle. Who's in charge here? The Pope said, I'm in charge. Frederick said, I'm in charge. Other kings, you see, were sort of posturing for political advantage in that discussion. And I think the Pope viewed this as a great chance to get the guy out of town. And so he authorizes Frederick to lead this Third Crusade to go back and take Jerusalem. And so Frederick follows this red line, if you can see that on the map there, and he leads a good-sized army across into Asia, but he died in southern Turkey in the year 1190, leaving this army without a leader, you see. And so, in desperation, there was an appeal for other leaders to come, and the two that came were Philip II of France and Richard I, known as the Lionheart of England. And so these two guys set sail. They come by sea. It's a faster route. They don't have huge armies with them to take over this Crusader army that was more or less parked there in southern Turkey. Philip and Richard didn't like each other very much. You know, the French and the English have had a long-standing sort of difference of opinion about a lot of stuff, and it was already the case here. Philip was part of the so-called Capetian rulers, dating back to Hugh Capet, who was the founder of a long-standing dynasty of French rulers during this era. And most of them were pretty good, and Philip was no exception. So he came. Richard, of course, was one of the Norman leaders in England that came after the Norman invasion about 100 years later. Both of these guys were pretty respectable and fairly competent, but they had a conflict of their own over who was going to run this show. They show up, they come to a city called Acre. They're able to, after a siege, take that city and reestablish a Crusader presence there. And once that took place, Philip returned to home, leaving the whole crusade effort in the hands of Richard. Richard, as you probably know, has a series of engagements against Saladin. And most of the conflicts are ambiguous in their outcomes, but the two guys develop a fairly respectable, robust appreciation of each other. And they both begin to view each other, even though they're on opposite sides of the conflict, something like brothers. I don't think they ever actually met, but they obviously have a fairly high regard for one another. The high point of this was when Richard fell deathly ill, to the point that it looked like he might die, and Saladin hired two of his best physicians, or summoned two of his best physicians, to go and provide treatment to Richard. And when they came into Richard's tent, he was a little nervous, to say the least. Physicians from Saladin, I'm not so sure about this, But he talked to them for a while, became convinced that they actually had his best interest at heart. He allowed them to examine him, diagnose the condition, and actually prescribe some kind of potion for him, which, as it turns out, had an immediately positive effect. And within a fairly short period of time, Richard was, back into good health. A couple of things came out of that. For one thing, Richard, of course, was a little less interested in just destroying Saladin. He came to appreciate that these people had something to offer. And further, he sort of had this epiphany that the Islamic world may have some things that we could use. Their expertise in science. Remember, this is the end of the golden age of Islam, the Baghdad era. And they had made great strides. Inventions, science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all of these were areas where the Islamic world had made great advances. So Richard and Saladin, even though they had this military conflict, wind up, at least in a kind of, don't want to overstate this, but with this kind of mutual regard for each other. Richard never succeeds in taking Jerusalem. He goes home, largely because he hears that John, his ne'er-do-well brother, is trying to take over the throne, usurp the throne. This is the backstory, of course, of Robin Hood, right? Robin of Locksley. This is when Richard is out of town. Robin Hood is a legendary character, a composite of the nobility that had been jilted by John. And so Richard, hearing that, goes home. Richard is kidnapped on the way, has a bunch of adventures. Finally, a ransom is paid. He gets home, pushes John out of the way, but dies 2 years later. It's probably more than you want to ever. Bye, choir, we love you. And Richard dies, so John actually winds up being the king. Just to connect a couple of dots, you may already know this, but it was John and his hostile attitude toward the nobility in England that finally pushed them so hard that they virtually forced John to sign a very famous document giving them certain rights as opposed to the rights of the king, and that great document, of course, is called the Magna Carta, right, 1215. So this is the same John, and my Anglophiles over here know all of this, so thank you very much, and that's kind of the quick story there. All right, the Fourth Crusade is the ugliest. Well, not the ugliest, I'd say the second ugliest. The stated purpose was once again to go back, notice it's right after the third one, which was viewed as a failure, to take Jerusalem, but on the way, these crusaders stopped off in Constantinople, and that's as far as they got. So the irony here is that the Crusades, which had originally been inspired by a desire to save Constantinople, by this time become an occasion for looting, pillaging, destroying that great city, and great treasures were taken out of Constantinople. This is widely regarded as the absolute death knell to any possibility of a reconciliation between East and West. To some degree, to this day, people in the Eastern Church remember this crusade as a time when Christian turned on Christian. And the city of Constantinople was virtually just gutted of its wealth. And all of this was taken back, and so this was, there was really no pretense of some sort of legitimate interest in Jerusalem or anything else. It did, however, result in immense wealth flowing back into Europe in general and Italy in particular. This was the time of the so-called Venetian Empire, when now you've got a huge amount of wealth beginning to accumulate in Italy, and that begins to set up, of course, the conditions for the Renaissance. So in many ways, the Crusades created the prospect of the Renaissance, largely because of this open door to a flow of wealth now that began to be realized from the East in various forms back into Europe. So that's the Fourth Crusade. The Children's Crusade was in 1212. That is the ugliest for sure. This was a incredibly miscalculated idea, largely children and teenagers up to about 15 years old, believing that God had sanctioned it. Unfortunately, there were not sane voices to prevent this. It was awful in the extreme. Most of these kids wound up dead or enslaved, and other horrific outcomes there. The final Crusades, the 5th through the 9th, really you just say the Crusades sputtered out. And it became more, by this time, of a kind of California gold rush mentality, you see. The religious themes were gone, except in the most superficial sense. And the real idea was there's gold and then there are hills. And these crusaders learned, I'm being somewhat cynical here, but I think in the main this is pretty much what was happening. They learned that they could go to the east and they could just grab stuff that was essentially viewed as trash from the Eastern perspective, but bring it back to Europe and it would sell for incredible amounts of money, you know. And so you have all kinds of trinkets, relics, all kinds of stuff, almost like a trafficking in a bunch of high-priced souvenirs. And it began to create, once again, a rising accumulation of wealth and a great concentration of wealth in the hands of certain European interests. And again, this led rather dramatically toward what we call the Renaissance. So what are the effects? I'll just briefly try to wrap this up. The Crusades ended feudalism. This is important because feudalism had been the backbone of European social order up until this time. It came in after Charlemagne. For a couple of hundred years, Europe was kind of a patchwork of decentralized authority here and there. For a variety of reasons that I won't bore you with right now, the effect of the Crusades was to emphasize the authority of the knights and to consolidate power in the kings. So it's really at this time that you begin to find the rise of what's sometimes called the nation states of Europe. It doesn't really happen yet, but it's a move in that direction, an increasing power in the king vis-a-vis the nobility. Some other things contribute. The chief weapon in feudalism, the most powerful force that you could put on a battlefield was called a knight, right? Knights in shining armor, lances and all of that. What the Crusaders discovered in the East was a funny little powder called gunpowder. And you can put a little short instrument in the hand of a 15-year-old kid, and he can take out a knight at 100 yards. How long did knights remain the weapon of choice? Not long, you see, and so the knight becomes obsolete during the Crusades. And a variety of other reasons, I won't labor these, but anyway, it ended feudalism. So Europe looks different as a result of the Crusades. There's vast wealth. There's always people smart enough to see a possibility of making a buck. And it didn't take long for folks to realize that these crusades, whatever else they were about the possibility of making a buck. And certain families began to rise to the surface that were very, very good at capitalizing. So banks had their origins. It's the Italian word banco, which just means a counter. And this was where you began to get the possibility of loans and interest and the possibility of making money. And of course, there's some famous families associated with banking interests in Italy, de Medici, Borgia, Sforza, certain others. And so you begin to see this kind of concentration of wealth. So the Crusades did that, kind of created this new economic reality in Europe. It sparked a new interest in things human. The Islamic world had been way ahead of the game in terms of science, nature, medicine, as we were saying, and all of this had to do with a focus on this world, not that one, this one. Augustine's influence, going way back to the 5th century, had been the importance of that world, Platonism. And there'd been a neglect, really, of nature and science. Now the Crusades open a new perspective on the importance of those things. So we call this the beginning of humanism. The earliest so-called Renaissance artist was named Giotto. He did something radical in his art. It still looks very medieval. He actually starts including little pictures of nature, branches of trees and stuff in his artwork. What's that doing there? People thought. This was radical at the time. But what was it? It was Giotto beginning to realize that nature has a place in art. It doesn't all have to be otherworldly visions, Byzantine images that are so otherworldly and strange looking. We can actually celebrate this world, and so the Crusades does that. Gives us a little bit of a new interest in humanity. I sound like a cheerleader for the Crusades. I'm really not, but I think we need to appreciate there were much more broad effects of it than sometimes are realized. Certainly a lot of technological events, the compass, the astrolabe, which was an instrument for navigating, as you know, out in the sea, by the stars and so on, gunpowder, various medical herbs, so on. All of these things really came back to Europe through the Crusades. And it certainly, and maybe most importantly, opened this fascination with the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, the great thinkers of the ancient world, the poets, the philosophers, the rhetoricians, the political theorists, the Stoics, others, all of this kind of became a new interest. So all of these things happened. The Crusades, as ugly as they were, did rewrite European history, and the church is part of that story. And so I'm taking the time to give you all of this because we're going to be referring back to it, and so this was a chance to just get it before us. All right. Let's turn our attention to a guy who lives right in the middle of this time frame, whose name is Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo, born in the middle of the 12th century, 1130 in Lyon, which is part of the Frankish world, of course. He was wealthy. He was one of the early beneficiaries of this opening of trade to the east. And although he was not directly involved with the Crusades, his family had realized some of the benefits of it. And so there had been a rising concentration of wealth and certain kind of the sort of a rising middle class, you might say at this time, and he was part of that. Because of his advantages, he was given a decent education, not what you'd call a scholarly education, but a decent education. He was part of a family that was involved in being cloth merchants, and so he had a comfortable life, and that was his beginnings. He considered himself a Roman Catholic, and he was more or less comfortable with that. I don't think he was an overly religious sort of spirit, but nevertheless he sort of was part of that culture and accepted that just as part of the reality of his life. He had three rather striking and life-changing events that all happened somewhat in rapid succession when he was in his early 30s. The first of these was he was at what we would call a cocktail party, nice garden party, lovely weather. He's hobnobbing with other folks in town who share similar kind of economic status and business interests, and so they're just having what you would call a kind of a social gathering. And he's talking to another fellow that he was a pretty good friend with, who also happened to be a cloth merchant, and they were talking business and so on. And just out of the blue, with no warning whatsoever, this friend of his was only about 5 years older than he, dropped dead in front of Peter Waldo. And it shook him to the core, because I think probably for the first time in his life, he realized the fragility of life, Here was a guy who seemed healthy, robust, planning his day tomorrow and his day in 5 years and making his, kind of arrangements to accomplish this or that, and boom, in a moment, he's in eternity. And Peter Waldo, as he writes about this later, said for days he wondered where that guy was. He wasn't ready to die. He didn't expect to die right then. He hadn't had the last rites. He hadn't had the kind of sacramental guarantees. Where was he? And Peter Waldo thought to himself, that could have been me. Why wasn't it me that passed into eternity there? And that kind of soul searching began. He was probably 34 years old when that occurred. This was complicated somewhat by a sermon he heard by a traveling minstrel. coming through Lyon. You know, this was the ancient version of the internet. This is how you kept up. And so through town, ever so often, these minstrels would come. And they would not only bring kind of some entertainment, a little bit of, you know, song and dance and that kind of thing. They'd bring news of the world, and they'd kind of earn their keep that way, and they'd get a little money for what they did and move on to the next town. So this guy had a kind of spiel that he did, and one of the messages he would give in the context of his presentations was little sermons, little sermonettes. And one of them was on a character named Saint Alexis, who had lived about 700 years earlier. And St. Alexis had famously heard a sermon on the rich young ruler, in which Jesus had said to him, "Go, sell what you have, give to the poor, come and follow me, and you'll have treasure in heaven," and so on. And St. Alexis had done that. A fairly wealthy guy, sold it all, gave it away, went and became what amounted to a monk and served the poor for the rest of his life. This minstrel is telling this story and celebrating what a great saintly character Alexis was, and it just hit Peter Waldo like a thunderbolt. Here he was in this comfortable life, and he was surrounded by very conspicuous poverty. He hadn't worried about it, you know. And now all of a sudden this sermon, the death of his friend, sort of conspired together to begin getting to his conscience. And then the third thing that happened was just about this time, the Roman Catholic, the Pope, made an official pronouncement about transubstantiation, which had been a developing doctrine of the church. It hadn't been really officially sort of promulgated by the church, but it was certainly being more or less taken for granted that the substance of the bread and wine become the substance of the body and blood of Christ. But what happened at this point was the Pope said, if you deny the doctrine of transubstantiation, you will be executed. And Waldo went, wait a minute, you know, that, and this is kind of characteristic of the move away from a moral authority to kind of a coercive authority. And it hit Peter wrong that there should all of a sudden, whether transubstantiation was true or not, to begin to simply pound people into submission rather than appealing somehow to their heart. To him, that didn't seem to make sense. And all of these things were swirling in his head until finally he decided he wanted to get, you know, into the scriptures himself. He was not educated in languages, so he actually had the means and resources to hire a couple of guys to translate the New Testament into French. He wanted to read it, and he couldn't go back and read the Greek or even the Latin, so he wanted to read it in French, so they did so. And as he read the New Testament in French, he was immediately struck by what seemed to him the conspicuous difference between the flavor of the Christian religion as described in the New Testament and the flavor of that religion as disseminated through the powers that were at that time in the church. And he believed that there had been some great departure from the proper path. And so he decided, very much on his own, without any sanction, to do what that parable had required. He took it as an instruction to him personally to sell what he had, give it to the poor, and adopt a very different life, going about barefoot, without any, sophisticated theological education, but simply preaching now from his newly translated French Bible to the people in town and a few surrounding communities, a message which essentially was a message of the simplicity of the gospel. And he really does emphasize faith in Christ at the heart of the matter. He sounds like a proto-Lutheran for sure. Not as much of a genius as Luther. Doesn't work it out with the same kind of robust energy as Luther, but it's definitely there. And he's just getting this from the sense of the New Testament, and along with that, a simplicity of life. Challenging people who used to be his peers, that they were becoming too obsessed with the benefits of comfortable living and forgetting the needs of those who were surrounding them all the time. So Peter Waldo starts off doing this. Some of his favorite texts were, "No man can serve two masters." He would preach frequently on that. But he also went a little further and began, much to his own peril, to condemn doctrines of the church at that time that he could find no evidence for in the Bible, namely purgatory and transubstantiation, knowing that that did put him at some risk, of course. He didn't see, and what he saw in these, and he makes it quite clear, was that these were being used as coercive devices of the church to manipulate the submission and obedience of the people. Kind of threats that put them into a sort of conscientious straitjacket that extorted from them the responses desired by the church, but bypassed ultimately the heart, the mind, the conscience. And he thought both of these were doing that. And he spoke quite clearly on that point, and that, of course, began to rattle a few cages in his environments. He went so far as to call the leadership of the church at that time the harlot of the book of Revelation. Those are scary words, especially at that time in history. But that was the kind of thing. So here's this guy who'd been a cloth merchant, all of a sudden out barefoot in the streets, preaching this kind of message. As you can imagine, he was greeted with mockery, with ridicule, with dismissal, with people going, "What happened to you, man? You used to put on a nice party. What happened?" Kind of deal. But Peter Waldo stayed his course. And that, of course, as you can imagine, precipitated eventually a conflict with the church, and this is in 1179. The Archbishop of the city of Lyon became aware of Peter, and of course by this time he had some followers who were actually beginning to call themselves the Waldensians. And so they were going out here and there, two by two, preaching a message comparable to Peter's message, really. Sometimes they'd come to town like peddlers, and they would be, as it were, selling kind of trinkets, this and that, but then they'd use that as an opportunity to tuck in little texts from the French translation of the Bible, not the whole thing, but maybe a text from 1 Corinthians or Matthew or something like that, and they'd use the opportunity to present their message and so on. Well, the Archbishop of Lyon becomes quite aware of this and concerned about it, and begins to move forces there in that region to actually have Peter arrested and tried for what were evidently his crimes. Peter decides to take the initiative, and with two or three of his closest associates, on his own, he went to Rome and asked for a hearing with the Pope in kind of the hope that if he could just present his case there before the Holy Father, that maybe the truth of what he's saying, maybe these people just got confused. Maybe they just see, "Oh, Peter, thank you. Oh, this is great." And so he went. And indeed, the Pope, who was by this point very much aware of him, did convene a gathering in which he was given an opportunity to present his case. The guy who writes the most thoroughly on the whole issue was a guy named Cardinal Mapp, M-A-P. And we still have what he wrote, kind of his recitation of the proceedings. And what he says, and indeed the counsel he gives to the Pope, goes something like this. It's really quite an amazing piece of literature. He says, these people, these Waldensians, are very much like the first century apostles. They travel around with apparently the same kind of style. They are delivering very much the same message, and they are finding the same kind of appeal among the common people. And you almost think Mapp is going to come out supporting them. But then in this breathtaking reversal, he says, therefore, we've got to get rid of these guys. These people, he said, could start a movement that would sweep like wildfire through Europe, and if they do, we will be destroyed. That's exactly what he said to the Pope. These guys are a danger. We need to rid ourselves of them, silence them, eliminate them. What's so striking to me in reading that is how it's almost like his playbook came right out of the book of Acts. Because that was exactly the way the Sanhedrin responded to the apostles. It was virtually the same response. And you think, don't you get this? I mean, what part of that aren't you quite following here? And that was the church's view. And so at a council that was already convened at that point, it was the Third Council of Lateran in 1179, Peter Waldo and all of his followers were condemned as heretics. But by that time, even after just whatever it was, about 10 years, there were so many of them that they could not, and they were protected by the kind of the popular level, and so they were not able to get rid of them. That gave rise then to this movement called the Waldensians. Martin Luther writes very, very affectionately of the Waldensians, who continued to survive even to his day and beyond. The Waldensians were never large in numbers. They never had the kind of sweeping numeric impact that came later, even with people like Huss or Wycliffe, and certainly with Luther. But they were always a kind of tiny little minority that was there, making life a little more complicated for a very politicized Catholic Church than it would have been otherwise. And these people would travel around, and they were basically, as I say, they'd pass themselves off as peddlers, not beggars, but they'd come to town with wares, and they'd sell them, but then they'd, as they had opportunity, would communicate this message. The last clear reference we have to the Waldensians is actually several hundred years later in the year 1655. This is 100 years after the beginning of the Reformation, 150 years almost. And the Waldensians are still there, virtually all of them in Catholic countries. In Protestant countries, they just became part of the Protestant movement. But in Catholic countries, they were a subculture and a minority, and a distinguished minority, so that's where they continue to reside. And there's a very famous, well, not famous, but it certainly is documented very well, that took place in Savoy, which is the southern part of France, in which a local bureaucrat decides we got to get rid of these Waldensians, and passes an edict to oust them from any homes they have, possessions, in the dead of winter. So they are forced in bitter cold to make a trip to the Alps and make a trek to another part of France. And again, there's a attack on them there, and it's a horrific moment in which thousands are killed, burned at the stake, dismembered, awful things, kind of the worst of the medieval forms of ghastly punishment and torture. And that came to the attention of Protestant nations. Switzerland, parts of Germany, England heard about this and actually mustered armies to come in and rescue these Waldensians, who by this time were just kind of a quiet population, almost like the Amish, you know, just sort of living and watching over their own affairs, not bothering anybody. And with that threat of a military intervention on behalf of these, they backed off. And then the Waldensians kind of fade from that point into the pages of history, and to my knowledge, we don't have any Waldensians in the world today. But anyway, for my money, I think this is where it began. This is the first really true inkling of what you'd call not just a moral reform, but a theological critique of where the church had come and the beginnings of what would eventually become the Reformation. So, back to our text here briefly. I think you can see the connection I was suggesting. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. I think we all know that it is one thing to say you are a Christian, it's another thing to be a Christian. The name of Christ has been used in history as a justification for a multitude of crimes. You know that. That's one of the great tragic and embarrassing aspects of Christian history, is that the name of Christ has been associated with ghastly and awful and criminal acts. And sometimes people can be led astray by the fact that the name Christ is being used in connection with these ghastly and ill-motivated efforts. Jesus, of course, seems to anticipate just that sort of thing when he says in a parable that there will be those who will say, "Lord, Lord, didn't we do such and so in your name?" And Jesus says, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you." You know, and how many things have been done in the name of Christ that Christ would ultimately repudiate? Well, we all know that. We can nod our heads to it, and we see the evidence of it over and over again in history. My warning to us is twofold. One, that we need to be on our guard because we are surrounded today by all kinds of movements and interests that say very, very lovely things about Christ, while at the same time promulgating values that essentially spit on the heart of what the law of Christ would require. And so we need to be on our guard because we, of course, see the evidence of that and watch for it. But the other, maybe more subtle warning is we need to be careful we're not those people. You know? I always have to ask myself, as I walk into a situation like this, to me, it's a high duty to stand up in a church and hold myself out as any kind of teacher, any kind, whether it's to 3-year-olds or to a body of scholars like you all are. What a weighty responsibility. And to be honest with you, it's easy to get some ego involved in this. You know what I'm saying? And you have to ask yourself, where is my heart vis-a-vis Christ? Am I walking in here? When you walk into the settings of ministry in which every one of you is involved, do you ask yourself the question, do I ask myself the question, is my first and foremost interest here not simply to use the name of Christ as a mechanism to gain some advantage, but am I really determined to honor Christ and do precisely what He would call me to do? I never do it well. I sometimes do it awful. But the question is that where our heart is? Is that where your heart is? Lest we be some of those who stand before Christ and He says to us, God forbid, depart from, I never knew you. Sure, you taught some Sunday school classes. Sure, you held yourself. But where was your heart? Where's our hearts? These people said they were Jews. People say they are Christians, but they're not. A synagogue of Satan. I don't believe this applies to any of you in this room, okay? Understand that? But it's a warning we all need to hear, isn't it? It's a warning we all need to